Oh, it started already. Okay, so The Renewed Terror by Uncle Joe Stalin. What a guy. So let's have a look. Why start the terror? Why renew the terror? Hadn't there been enough terror? Clearly not. Not for Uncle Joe. So let's have a look. So Joseph Stalin. The big thing that he was concerned about was ideological contamination. Now, why was this? How could his ideology be contaminated? Well, during the Great Patriotic War, the reason I call him Uncle Joe is because that's how he was known in the Western press. The British and the Americans ran favourable news stories about him because he was an ally in the Grand Alliance. And that meant that Western military advisors and attaches and diplomats were quite popular during the Great Patriotic War in Moscow. Okay? So many Westerners went to Moscow to help out with the war effort, all right, to give military advice, etc., on how to use, the lorries and trucks which the Americans were donating to the Soviets under Lend-Lease. So friendships were made. Now, when these friendships were made, I'm sure that quite a few Americans and British men who were out there giving that advice would tell them about their living standards in the West. This made Joseph Stalin very paranoid about this. He was worried that his Soviet citizens could be ideologically contaminated by the decadence of imperialistic capitalism. Of course, he didn't want that, did he? So, also, he was paranoid about the Soviet prisoners of war who had allowed themselves, in their what he would call cowardice, to be taken prisoner. His own son was taken prisoner in the Great Patriotic War. Stalin said anyone who allowed themselves to be taken prisoner was essentially a coward and a traitor. So when it was found out that his son was taken prisoner, you know what he said? He said, "I have no son. I have no son." His son tried to escape the concentration camp and was shot by Nazi troops as a consequence. Some people said that he committed suicide because he knew that he couldn't escape, but he was so miserable in that concentration camp that he just wanted to die. So, Stalin, can you imagine this, right? Can you actually imagine? Right, you've been in a concentration camp for like a number of years. All right, imagine you were taken prisoner in 1941. Okay, in Operation Barbarossa. You've been taken prisoner. You're in a concentration camp. You make it through those 4 years. The Red Army, the mighty Red Army, sweeps into Germany, and you're freed from the camp. And then you're sent to the Gulag straight away. Okay, from the concentration camp to the Gulag. You could not make it up. What a miserable life. What a miserable life, okay, these men led. All right, but that's what happened. Because he was worried that these Soviet prisoners of war had spent too much time outside the USSR and had been indoctrinated into Nazi ideology or capitalist ideology. So Stalin thought these people would be against him. Also, let's not forget, Stalin had personally insulted them by calling them traitors and cowards. So they're not exactly going to be too well inclined towards Stalin. So Stalin realizes that these Soviet prisoners of war, they need to be subdued. So he puts them in the Gulag. All right. So over 200,000 were found guilty of collaborating with the enemy and sent to Gulag camps, out of nearly 2 million Soviet soldiers who returned from captivity. That's around 10%, isn't it? 10%. So they would shop each other in, wouldn't they? If you were taken prisoner, you would denounce someone who was like a real collaborator, wouldn't you? Or you just denounce someone anyway, just to get yourself out of the trouble. So you'd imagine that, like, this denunciation culture was very, very common. Also, there are new areas, and I've mentioned this earlier, to the USSR, especially the Baltic states. And Stalin wanted these Baltic states to show unwavering loyalty to the Soviet Union. Now, obviously, they hadn't spent the last, from 1917 to 1945, they hadn't spent that time in the Soviet Union. So this meant that Stalin was especially paranoid about them not being ideologically contaminated by decadent Western capitalism. So if someone from the Baltic states was seen speaking to a foreigner, an American or a British soldier or someone that had gone there to help in a war effort, and they were known to be especially friendly, they could see them arrested and again sent to a gulag. Stalin was especially concerned with Western spies. Now, I'm not going to deny it would be very silly to deny that they existed. Did Britain and America have spies that spied on the Soviets? Of course they did. Did the Soviets have spies which spied on the British, the Americans? Of course they did. It's like everyone knows everyone else spies, yeah, but they never admit to spying themselves. So there were Western spies out there. So he did have a right to feel somewhat fearful of this, okay? But again, we're starting, sometimes the medicine is worse than the sickness, okay? I'd say. So, and it's understanding the Cold War era. After Germany was defeated and there's no longer a common enemy, the only enemy can be the capitalist powers, right? The USA, Britain. So you get a Cold War era emerge, an era of mutual suspicion, an era of proxy conflicts, okay, across the world. So that's something we're going to look into, especially with America's sphere of influence in Europe from a Soviet perspective, because we often talk about the Soviet sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, but we don't really talk about America's sphere of influence with the NATO alliance and Western Europe. Okay, so this is something we're going to look into in greater depth, something that's especially relevant today. Okay, right, and I end it on that note. Lovely job.